Henry Henderson was at his wit's end.
The city was like a vacuum sucking in illegal dumping activities. This is clearly wrong. This is clearly illegal. And there clearly is the authority to make this stop.
The commissioner of Chicago's Department of the Environment had spent the last several years fighting John Christopher's illegal dumps. And yet, the mountains of debris remained in North Lawndale. Henderson had reasoned with John Christopher. He had threatened him with legal action. He'd eventually taken him to court. But even with a civil ruling against him, the courts had failed. Henderson had even turned to the State Environmental Protection Agency. None of it had worked.
Well, John Christopher basically disappeared.
Henry Henderson had not been able to bring John Christopher to justice or get justice for the people of North Lawndale. But Henry Henderson had one more card to play.
Scott's an old friend, and he was a first assistant at the time.
Henderson called on Scott Lazar, first assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Illinois. In other words, one of Chicago's top federal prosecutors. Lazar's office had the power to bring federal criminal charges against John Christopher.
Saying, we think that this is a larger criminal endeavor here, and we really need some help.
Henry was like Inspector Javert going after Christopher.
That's Scott Lazar. And Inspector Javert is the police inspector from Les Miserables, who relentlessly hunts down the main character over the course of the story. It's not a perfect comparison, but basically, Lazar knew Henderson was on a mission.
He knew about Christopher, and he'd been pursuing him for a long time.
And even though they were friends, Lazar gives Henderson the brush off.
I had to rebuff him.
Lazar basically says, "Sorry, Henry, we can't help you catch this John Christopher guy. The DOJ doesn't work on municipal waste issues." But that wasn't the real reason.
We couldn't tell Henry. Christopher was working undercover at that time.
Not only did the federal government already know all about John Christopher was on its payroll, even while he was dumping in North Lawndale.
This was a secret undercover investigation, which was one of the more successful undercover investigations that our office conducted. And so we weren't going to end it.
Chicago's most notorious illegal dumper was also working for the FBI. I'm Robin Amer, and from USA Today, this is The City. So who was this guy who showed up to a vacant lot on Chicago's West Side in a limousine? Who is John Christopher really? To answer that question, we need to go back to January 1979 and then Mayor Michael Bilandic.
We had 24 million tons of snow, over 24 million, that fell on the city of Chicago. It's been labeled an emergency area by the federal government.
Even in the pantheon of Chicago winters, this was one for the ages. People still talk about the blizzard of 1979, and not just because of all the snow. Bilandic had to defend his administration's response to this record snowfall to an angry and skeptical city council.
We had enough snow here, and enough streets, 4,000 miles of streets. That's the distance from Chicago to Los Angeles and back.
Meteorologists had forecast just 2 to 4 inches of snow, and so Chicago was completely unprepared when the blizzard instead dumped more than 20 inches on the city. The storm collapsed roofs and trapped people in their homes, paralyzing the city for weeks. And getting rid of all that snow would prove to be a monumental challenge for the city.
When you're concerned about getting equipment and people out to the street, you're not doing an accounting at the same time. We'll have an opportunity to do that at a later point.
The ensuing cleanup and that lack of accounting presented a perfect opportunity for then 28-year-old John Christopher. The city hired private contractors to help clear the streets, and Christopher had a guy inside city government who paid him for snow removal work he never did.
I don't recall the exact facts of that case, but I can say that he was alleged to have been submitting false invoices.
This is Jim Davis. He was an FBI agent from 1985 to 2011. And this epic snowstorm would eventually cause his life to intersect with John Christopher's in a very big way.
I talked to John every day, multiple times, every single day from July of 1992 until January of 1996. You know, I probably had a closer relationship with him during that time than anyone else. And it was a kind of a love-hate relationship.
If you Google Jim Davis, FBI, one of the first hits you get is a photo of a very tall man in a black shirt with dog tags around his neck. That's Jim Davis. He's standing in front of a white tiled wall and he's looking straight at the camera. In one hand, he's holding a piece of paper that reads FBI 12 December 2003. And his other hand is resting on the shoulder of Saddam Hussein.
I arrested Saddam Hussein, you know. I'm telling you, man, life is like a box of chocolates, man. I am the Forrest Gump of the FBI.
Jim Davis calls himself the Forrest Gump of the FBI because he has a tendency to show up in big moments in history, like Saddam Hussein's arrest. He and John Christopher were well matched in that way. A federal prosecutor gave John Christopher almost the same nickname, Chicago's, quote, Forrest Gump of crime. In the many hours they later spent together, Jim Davis learned a lot about John Christopher's illegal schemes, including the one he pulled during the blizzard of '79.
He had gone to some corrupt folks at the Driver's License Bureau, you know, the Secretary of State's office he had had a previous relationship with. He got a driver's license in the name of Richard McCann.
In the chaos after the blizzard, John Christopher was part of a group of people that conspired to defraud the city. They submitted fake invoices for snow removal work they never did. The company name they used was McCann Construction, so the city issued a check in the name of Richard McCann, the name on John Christopher's fake ID. The check was for $112,000, a decent haul for not having cleared so much as a teaspoon of snow. So check in hand, John Christopher walked into a bank. He tried to cash the check, but something about him raised a red flag with bank employees who asked him for his ID.
And, you know, these guys looked at John, who is Italian, and said, you know, you don't look Irish.
John Christopher responded by saying he was adopted. But McCann, the name on his fake ID, had blown his cover. And so John Christopher handled these bank employees the way he normally handled people who got in his way. He tried to bribe them. He offered to take the vice president of the bank out to lunch, and when that didn't work, he offered him a Betamax, an expensive precursor to the VHS. But the bank manager didn't budge.
So he ended up calling the FBI.
The city had paid John Christopher from a pool of money that came from federal disaster relief funds, which meant that John Christopher hadn't just defrauded the city. He had also defrauded the federal government. The FBI arrested John Christopher, and he now faced up to 15 years in prison. Without knowing it, he'd also helped alter the course of Chicago history. More than 30 other companies were also investigated for defrauding Chicago's snow disaster fund. At least one city official was indicted for helping them. And Mayor Bilandic was blamed for letting it all happen on his watch. In the next election, he'd lose to an upstart, anti-machine candidate named Jane Byrne, who became the only woman ever to serve as Chicago's mayor. This is why people still talk about the blizzard of 1979. It wasn't just all the snow. It was the political fallout. John Christopher's entanglement with the law started long before the blizzard. He came up in a world where being the Forrest Gump of Chicago crime wasn't all that remarkable. John Christopher grew up just a few miles from North Lawndale, in an Italian neighborhood full of families descended from the old Taylor Street crew, one of the original street crews of the Chicago outfit, which in Chicago is what we call the mob.
His great uncle was a guy named Fior Buccieri. They called him Fifi. And he was kind of a notorious mob guy, in the 50s and 60s.
The press described Buccieri as a West Side overlord in charge of loan sharking and other rackets. He was also suspected of having been involved in multiple murders, one of which was incredibly gruesome. I'll spare you the details, but I can tell you that it involved a blowtorch and a cattle prod. Buccieri was later caught on an FBI wire, laughing and bragging about it. He was never indicted for murder, but he was indicted late in life for theft, soliciting others to commit theft, and possession of $200,000 worth of stolen construction equipment. John Christopher's crimes, at least the ones he told the FBI about, started when he was a teenager.
He was a tough street kid, and, if you look at some of the transcripts, he often refers to himself as, being on the corner, or, this is the way I operate on the corner. Some guys go to college, I came from the corner.
When he was a teenager in the mid to late 60s, John Christopher joined a neighborhood street gang called the Jokers. He'd later tell Jim Davis that the Jokers would, quote, protect their neighborhood from any, quote, undesirable elements. That meant mostly Black families who were moving to the West Side as it transitioned from white to Black. John Christopher and the Jokers threatened and intimidated these newcomers, and in some cases, threw Molotov cocktails into their buildings. John Christopher was arrested at 19 for breaking into cars. He tried to bribe both the arresting officer and the judge. He was sent to the army instead of prison, but was honorably discharged soon after. He told the FBI that he thought his great-uncle Fifi had something to do with getting him out. A few years later, his father got him a job with the Department of Streets and Sanitation. John Christopher and the other workers would often sit around the office playing cards instead of working. One day, someone from the Inspector General's office caught them slacking off. The inspector threatened to report them, so John Christopher and his colleagues beat up the inspector and told him to write a good report on the unit, which he did. But ultimately, defrauding the federal government after the blizzard of 1979 was what put him on the FBI's radar. John Christopher's snow fraud case went to trial in 1980, but ended in a mistrial. And while he was waiting for a new trial to begin,
He was looking for a silencer to kill a witness against him.
a silencer. Silencers are those devices you attach to the muzzle of a gun to muffle the sound of a shot. They were and still are illegal in Illinois. The FBI had gotten word from an informant that John Christopher was in the market for a silencer, allegedly so he could murder a federal witness. So the FBI coordinated with an undercover agent from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in order to sell him one.
It was a buy-bust scenario, right? So it just all happened at once.
John Christopher was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for possession of the silencer and another 8 years for trying to cash the snow removal check. But behind bars, he stayed true to his roots.
John didn't rat.
In the parlance of the outfit, John was a stand-up guy. He didn't snitch on anyone else who'd been involved in the snow fraud, even though he could have parlayed that information for a lighter sentence.
He's associated to the mafia in Chicago. There were other people that were involved in that scheme that John didn't give up. So he went to prison for them, didn't, take anybody down. And I think that he expected that in return for that.
In return, Jim Davis says, John Christopher expected the mob to support his family, since he would not be able to provide for them while he was locked up.
I think that he expected that they would do a better job of taking care of his family while he was in prison. And they hadn't done that.
After roughly 4 years in federal prison, John Christopher was put on parole. He returned to his old ways, but he also came back with doubts about his loyalty to the mob. This is ultimately how Jim Davis would become John Christopher's FBI handler. When the Bureau exploited John Christopher's doubts about the mob, and he crossed over and started wearing a wire. That's after the break.
Fall is the busiest time of year for me. I always have a lot of plans with friends, going out for drinks, seeing a lot of movies. All of that really feeds my soul, but it doesn't leave me much time to cook delicious, healthy food that's going to nourish my body. So, when I need healthy fuel fast, I know exactly where to turn. Daily Harvest. Daily Harvest delivers perfectly portioned cups of frozen organic fruits and vegetables directly to your door. All you have to do is add water or your favorite milk to your cup and then just blend or heat. I started out with Daily Harvest's plant-based, ready-to-blend protein smoothies and activated breakfast bowls, both really delicious, all the flavors I've tried. But now I'm falling in love with their new savory Harvest Bowls. They're an amazing, healthy dinner that's faster than takeout. The cauliflower rice with pesto is my latest favorite. If that sounds good to you, go to daily-harvest.com and enter promo code THECITY to get 3 cups free in your first box. That's promo code THECITY for 3 free Daily Harvest cups at daily-harvest.com. daily-harvest.com. If you've ever needed to hire, you know that the right person can have a huge impact on your business. And the pressure to find that person can be overwhelming. The great news is, the easiest place to find that next great hire is right under your nose: LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the world's largest professional network. 70% of the U.S. workforce is already there. Most LinkedIn members haven't recently visited the top job boards, but 9 out of 10 members are open to new opportunities, so you can only reach them on LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs matches people to your role based on who they really are, their skills, interests, and even how open they are to new opportunities. This way, your job gets seen by more of the right people. That's why a new hire is made every 10 seconds using LinkedIn. And businesses rate LinkedIn 40% higher than job boards at delivering quality candidates. Hurry to linkedin.com/thecity and get $50 off your first job post. That's linkedin.com/thecity to get $50 off your first job post. linkedin.com/thecity. Terms and conditions apply.
When John Christopher got out of prison in the late 1980s, he came back to Chicago and started a construction company, one that did road repair and paved parking lots and crushed gravel. By June of 1990, he had set up his illegal dumps in North Lawndale. And to help establish his new business, he turned to a familiar ruse: bank fraud. John Christopher's second run-in with the FBI starts with a bank failure.
John had made some false statements related to loans that he had received from Cosmopolitan Bank to buy his trucks for his business.
Cosmopolitan National Bank goes belly up. It fails, and that attracts the attention of the FBI's Financial Crime Squad.
An agent there named Tony D'Angelo, he identified John Christopher as a subject in that investigation.
Basically what I did is I looked at everything that was going on in the bank.
This is Tony D'Angelo. Cosmopolitan Bank had seemed like it was thriving, with money in its vault and plenty of account holders.
And I'm wondering, how can a well-capitalized bank in the late 1980s all of a sudden go into receivership? So I looked at the bad loans.
And who turns out to be at the center of this bank failure?
Once I looked at the bad loans, probably the biggest bad loan at the bank was for an individual named John Christopher and his various entities. Mr. Christopher had a couple of trucking companies, some other businesses, and he had borrowed, I can't remember the exact amount, but I believe the total deficit to the bank was in the millions.
$2.5 million. That's what John Christopher would later say in court.
And he also overstated the success of his companies, his trucking businesses. So he basically made up income that was not there.
It looked like John Christopher had used these bad loans to build up his business.
It's easy to build up your business, especially when you're not paying the loans back.
So Tony D'Angelo does a background check on John Christopher and finds he's already in the FBI's database.
I was amazed because I found out he was a convicted felon, organized crime.
Tony D'Angelo learns all about the snow fraud case and the silencer and the alleged plan to murder a federal witness, and about John Christopher's ties to the outfit.
I knew he was extremely bad news.
With his criminal background, it was highly unlikely that John Christopher would actually qualify for millions of dollars in bank loans. So Tony D'Angelo begins to suspect that the bank president must be in on it. D'Angelo wanted to use John Christopher to get to the bank president. But
everybody told me John Christopher will not talk to you. There's absolutely no way he's going to cooperate. He's not going to talk to you. It's a waste of time.
He decides to try anyway. He finds John Christopher's number and calls him.
And actually picked up the phone. So I introduced myself. I take a low-key approach. So I told him who I was. You know, I looked at your dealings with Cosmopolitan Bank. I've got you dead to right on financial fraud with your loan application.
You might think John Christopher would just hang up the phone at this point. But Tony D'Angelo says, just meet with me. All you have to do is listen.
And I found in my career that people are very curious. They want to know what information you have about them, what evidence. I also mentioned to him, you know, I know you just got out of jail. You had a couple kids. Maybe we can help each other. So ultimately, he agreed to meet me. He wanted to meet me alone, so I did meet him alone. We met at a Pizza Hut in Cicero, Illinois.
Cicero is a suburb just west of Chicago. It's where Al Capone based a lot of his operations. And this Pizza Hut was less than a 10-minute drive from the North Lawndale dumps. So when Henry Henderson, the environment commissioner, says,
well, John Christopher basically disappeared.
John Christopher was just a mile or two away, eating pizza with the FBI. Here's how Tony D'Angelo describes that first meeting.
John Christopher was out of central casting for The Sopranos. I mean, if you want to know a mobbed-up guy, take a picture of John Christopher. Built like a bull, about 5'10", stocky, no neck, wearing a members-only jacket, talks in dems and does. So I laid out my case against him. You know, I said, I'm a fellow Italian. Why don't we meet a couple more times? You can just listen to me talk. You don't have to do anything. So we established a comfort level.
So they meet again at the same Pizza Hut in Cicero.
I knew he had, I think one of his sons was about 8 or 10, and during the first conversation, he mentioned that his son liked baseball. I brought him a box of baseball cards for his son.
They talk again and again and again, and pretty soon, they're talking regularly. But they're not talking about the dumps or the people living near them.
With each meeting, you establish more of a rapport, more of a trust factor, get to know each other, and I'm doing an analysis of him, what's making him tick.
Tony D'Angelo learns that John Christopher is still angry about the way his family was treated while he was in prison.
That promises have been broken. Usually he wouldn't bring something like that up, so that was something that you could tell he was harboring a deep-seated resentment over his family not being taken care of. I think he was really scared about serving another long stretch in prison and not seeing his kids, knowing that they're going to be teenagers and not being there to have any influence over their lives.
Slowly but surely, John Christopher starts to give the FBI information. First about Cosmopolitan National Bank. The bank president would later be convicted for bribery, bank fraud, and tax evasion. And pretty soon, John Christopher would give the Bureau much, much more. That's after the break. FBI Special Agent Tony D'Angelo had made himself a fixture in John Christopher's life.
I would travel around with him and go to meetings with him, and I had a cover. John introduced me as his pin-headed lawyer from down in Springfield.
Wait, what kind of meetings would you go to with him?
We had a meeting at once in Greektown, and the owner of the restaurant came up, and John, he'd get a cup of coffee, and rather than use a spoon, he'd stick his big fat finger in there and stir it up. And he looked at the owner of the restaurant. He goes, "If you don't pay your milk money, you're going to get a pineapple through the window."
In other words, he's threatening to bomb the restaurant.
And I guess this guy maybe had fallen behind his payments. That's probably why John picked this restaurant for the meeting.
The FBI was grooming John Christopher as an informant, and here he was making threats right in front of one of its agents.
I kicked him under the table, and he looked over and forgot I was sitting there.
In moments like these, John Christopher was inadvertently revealing that his crimes still went way beyond bank fraud. Crimes the FBI was willing to overlook, like that 6-story dump in a certain West Side neighborhood.
One day during one of these meetings, he goes, "Oh, are you interested in politicians?"
John Christopher saying this to an FBI agent, this was a big deal. Remember, John Christopher was a stand-up guy. He never ratted on anyone, even when it could have meant less prison time. And he knew the stories about his great-uncle Fifi, about what the mob could do to anyone who crossed them. But John Christopher had done the math. Given all the evidence Tony D'Angelo had amassed against him, he was almost certainly facing prison time for the Cosmopolitan bank fraud. And based on what had happened before, he suspected that if he went back to prison, his family would not be taken care of. So when John Christopher asks,
"Oh, are you interested in politicians?" I said, "Absolutely. What do you have on politicians?" Well, little did I know at the time that John Christopher had been bribing and paying off and doing whatever he needed to do with aldermen and various city officials.
Tony D'Angelo had just landed a major informant, one so big he was now outside of his purview. So the FBI calls on its public corruption squad and Special Agent Jim Davis. And at first, Jim Davis is skeptical about this new informant.
Hey, I'm an FBI agent. I'm skeptical of everybody. It just kind of sounded too good to be true from the perspective of a guy doing a corruption investigation. This guy walks in the door and basically says, "I am a bribing machine." And I was trying to verify that. I wanted to make sure that he was telling me the truth.
As they're sitting down for one of their first interviews, Jim Davis decides to give John Christopher a little test to see if he's really equipped to bribe an elected official. Across the interview table, Jim Davis asks John Christopher how much money he has on him. And in response, John Christopher stands up and empties his pockets, pulling out change and balls of lint and gum wrappers.
So I said, "Okay, John, if a public official came by today and said, I need $500, what would you do?" And he says, "Oh," and he reached into his back pocket and he pulled out 5 $100 bills that he kept in his back pocket specifically for paying bribes. And that's the way he walked around life.
John Christopher tells Jim Davis that he's been bribing 24th Ward Alderman Bill Henry to the tune of $5,000 a month. And not only Bill Henry.
John said to us that he'd been paying public officials his entire life.
There's another alderman whose palm he greased in exchange for help setting up yet another rock crusher. There are city inspectors who showed up at the dumps. There are city workers. He'd bribe them even if he wasn't totally sure what they could do to help him, just as a way of, quote, keeping the heat off.
He had grown up in Chicago, doing business in Chicago, committing kind of petty crimes when he was a younger kid that they resolved by, bribing police officers or prosecutors.
To John Christopher, this was just the cost of doing business.
So his entire life had been kind of ingrained with this idea that you paid public officials to get through life.
To people in North Lawndale, the illegal dumping was the only one of John Christopher's crimes that mattered. But the FBI's interest was elsewhere. To the Bureau, the illegal dumps were just one chapter in John Christopher's long criminal history. Why take him down for dumping on the West Side when you could instead use him to catch corrupt city officials all over town? Because if John Christopher really was this bribing machine, then he presented the FBI with a unique opportunity. If he could wear a wire and record his meetings with city officials, record his bribes to city officials, there was no telling how many crooked politicians they could catch. Because here's this guy, a stand-up guy who never ratted, who's engaged in all kinds of illegal activity, who's connected to the outfit. I mean, he's the great-nephew of notorious mobster Fifi Buccieri. He's the Forrest Gump of Chicago crime. He's exactly the kind of guy you'd never suspect of working for the FBI, which would make him the perfect FBI mole.
And I don't think that we've ever had anybody who had his level of credibility who was working with us. Right? I had a sense that this was going to be a big case.
And so when Henry Henderson reaches out to his friend Scott Lazar, the federal prosecutor,
saying, we think that this is a larger criminal endeavor here, and we really need some help.
Scott Lazar had to give Henderson the brush off.
I had to rebuff him.
Because John Christopher had already been recruited by the FBI.
We couldn't tell Henry about it. Christopher was working undercover at that time.
The feds could have sent John Christopher to prison in 1991. Federal prosecutors could have gone after him for illegal dumping. The mountain, the dust, the asthma, the cracked foundations. The feds could have ended it all. But letting it continue was useful.
This was a secret undercover investigation. It was one of the more successful undercover investigations that our office conducted. And so we weren't going to end it. I mean, we knew about the illegal dumping going on very well because that was at the heart of the investigation.
That's next time on The City. The City is a production of USA Today and is distributed in partnership with Wondery. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, NPR One, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate and review us and be sure to tell your friends about us. Our show was reported and produced by Wilson Sayer, Jenny Casas, and me, Robin Amer. Our editor is Sam Greenspan. Ben Austin is our story consultant. Original music and mixing is by Hannes Brown. Additional production by Taylor Macon, Isabel Cockerell, and Bianca Medias. Chris Davis is our VP for Investigations. Scott Stein is our VP of Product. Our executive producer is Liz Nelson. The USA Today Network's president and publisher is Maribel Wadsworth. Thank you to our sponsors for supporting the show. And special thanks to Misha Youssef and Danielle Svetkov. Additional support comes from the Fund for Investigative Journalism and the Social Justice News Nexus at Northwestern University. Archival audio courtesy of WBBM News Radio 780 and 105.9 FM. If you like this show, you may also like WBEZ's new podcast, On Background, which takes you inside the smoke-filled back rooms of Chicago and Illinois government to better understand the people, places, and forces shaping today's politics. I'm Robin Amer. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at The City Pod, or visit our website where you can find photos of the blizzard of 1979 and more. That's thecitypodcast.com.